It was earlier today, Brooke. We now know, according to two U.S. defense officials in the Baltic Sea, an Air Force reconnaissance plane was flying in international airspace, according to these officials, when a Russian Su-27 came up alongside and did this barrel roll maneuver. And of course, what that means is the plane came up alongside the American plane, inverted at high speed, and flew around and came back to the other side. This is a very high-speed, very dangerous maneuver, and it's estimated the Russians came within 100 feet of the U.S. aircraft. The U.S. is very opposed to these kinds of maneuvers. They are very dangerous, the U.S. says, and they can lead to absolute disaster in the skies. The question now, it's the second barrel roll this month, also a U.S. Navy warship closely intercepted by Russian aircraft who flew with just in a few feet of the Navy deck. What is Moscow up to? And if U.S. officials tell me they are still uncertain whether these dangerous maneuvers are being ordered at the highest levels in Moscow or whether these are Russian pilots out there hot-dogging, taking tremendous risk.
This is something we know that North Korea has been working on for a long time. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff saying that Pyongyang has fired what it believes to be a ballistic missile from a submarine. Now, they say that it flew for about 30 kilometers or just under 20 miles. And in order for this type of launch from a submarine to be considered a success, it needs to fly for around 300 kilometers or just over 180 miles. Now, clearly, it fell far short of that, but South Korean officials are not directly calling this a failure, and with good reason. Every test that North Korea does takes it one step closer to its goal. It always learns something, no matter what the outcome. And of course, if in fact North Korea did manage to fire a ballistic missile from a submarine, no matter how far it went, that would be significant. One US official telling us just how worrying this development is for Washington, saying, quote, North Korea's sub-launch capability has gone from a joke to something very serious. The US is watching this very closely. And of course, the timing is very interesting, as it always is with North Korea. 2016 has been very busy. It's been very tense. There's been that purported H-bomb test in January, a satellite launch, a claim of miniaturizing a nuclear warhead. And of course, it just comes ahead of a very rare Congress, a Workers' Party Congress in early May, which hasn't been held since 1980 and will likely be used by leader Kim Jong-un to strengthen his power and his grip on power. And of course, South Korean officials believe that there could even be a fifth nuclear test ahead of that meeting. Paula Hancock's CNN Seoul.
Barack Obama has announced today the biggest escalation of America's intervention in Syria to date, with a further 250 troops now on top of dozens who are already on the ground there.
A small number of American Special Operations Forces are already on the ground in Syria, and their expertise has been critical as local forces have driven ISIL out of key areas. So given the success, I've approved the deployment of up to 250 additional U.S. personnel in Syria, including special forces, to keep up this momentum.
Well, all positives as he's selling it. There seems to be mixed messages over the years. We'll talk about that in a minute. But was any of this a surprise, what he had to say this morning?
Well, Kevin, this certainly came as quite a bit of a revelation, because we certainly don't have to travel back too far in time to remember very different statements.
I do not foresee a scenario in which boots on the ground in Syria, American boots on the ground in Syria, would not only be good for America, but also would be good for Syria. There have been a few who suggested that we should put large numbers of U.S. troops on the ground. It is not just my view, but the view of my closest military and civilian advisors that that would be a mistake.
Well, these latest announcements to send an additional 250 military personnel to Syria are certainly part of a bigger picture that Barack Obama has been painting here in Hanover on his European tour, where he's been talking about the threats that the U.S. and the EU together as NATO allies continue facing. He's been talking about ISIL being the biggest threat, followed by the need for Europe to stay unified, as well as continue to talk about Russia's aggression when it comes to Ukraine and the future of peace in Europe. Let's take a listen.
A lot of workers and families are still struggling to recover. Today, dangerous forces do threaten to pull the world backwards. Barbaric terrorists have slaughtered innocent people in Paris and Brussels and Istanbul and San Bernardino, California. Russian aggression has flagrantly violated the sovereignty and territory of an independent European nation, Ukraine. And that unnerves our allies in Eastern Europe, threatening our vision of a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace.
He's covered a fair bit already. What more's to come as we know it over there in Hanover?
Well, Kevin, other European leaders are gathering here for talks later on today, where they're going to be meeting with Obama, Merkel, and the leader of France, the UK, and Italy are going to be getting together like old friends to discuss these and other issues. Migration, of course, terrorism is going to continue to dominate the agenda. Syria, Russia, all of this expected to take place during this tour by Barack Obama, which is kind of partially seen, despite the fact that NATO leaders are going to be meeting in Warsaw in July, as a sort of a goodbye tour, a nostalgia tour, because in his speeches and press conferences here in Hanover over the last 2 days, he has had this sort of sadder, nostalgic tone, looking back on his presidency, talking about how the U.S. and the world was able to pick up the pieces after the financial crash. He's been trying to convince people that the world is actually now better off now that his presidency is coming to an end. He's been talking about how security and privacy can walk hand in hand together, which has been quite ironic to see Angela Merkel just sitting 30 meters away from him, considering her phone conversations were wiretapped. So, you know, the leaders are getting together to discuss these issues, but a lot of it is seen as a sort of goodbye tour where Barack Obama is looking back and also trying to point out what he would like to see in the future.
Syria's ceasefire is in tatters. The latest, an airstrike on an opposition hospital in Aleppo. This one supported by Doctors Without Borders and the Red Cross. Dozens killed, including children and at least 3 doctors. One of them, the last pediatrician. So severe the attack, the Red Cross issued a statement saying the destruction of the hospital are putting millions at grave risk. The bodies, the grief, piling pressure on faltering peace talks in Geneva.
In the last 48 hours, we have had an average of 1 Syrian killed every 25 minutes. 1 Syrian wounded every 13 minutes.
3 weeks of talks, 1,000 miles from the front lines, little progress. The two sides using the ceasefire to talk about political transition, but accusations, not compromises, traded.
The threats that emanated from the opposition who were here in Geneva before they sulked and got upset and left. These declarations were translated on the ground into attacks.
The opposition, for their part, pausing their participation, blaming the government for renewed offensive, making talks meaningless. Within days of pulling back from the talks, opposition fighters last week on ceasefire, shown here in their own propaganda video, back to the battlefront. The UN envoy urging Russia and the United States to step in again, save the ceasefire, save the talks.
We need that to be urgently revitalized. And only the Russian Federation and the US, as they did when they launched suddenly everything related to the cessation of hostilities, needed to come back again and relaunch it.
In the meantime, the killing is escalating. No date set for the next round of peace talks. The UN envoy planning a visit to Moscow next week. Urgency and peace, both in short supply.
It was earlier today, Brooke, we now know, according to two U.S. defense officials in the Baltic Sea, an Air Force reconnaissance plane was flying in international airspace, according to these officials, when an SU, a Russian Su-27, came up alongside and did this barrel roll maneuver. And of course, what that means is the plane came up alongside the closely intercepted by Russian aircraft who flew with just in a few feet of the Navy deck. What is Moscow up to? And if U.S. officials tell me they are still uncertain whether these dangerous maneuvers are being ordered at the highest levels in Moscow or whether these are Russian pilots out there hot-dogging, taking tremendous risk. American plane inverted at high speed and flew around and came back to the other side. This is a very high-speed, very dangerous maneuver, and it's estimated the Russians came within 100 feet of the U.S. aircraft. The U.S. is very opposed to these kinds of maneuvers. They are very dangerous, the U.S. says, and they can lead to absolute disaster in the skies. The question now, it's the second barrel roll this month, also a U.S. Navy warship.
This is something we know that North Korea has been working on for a long time. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff saying that Pyongyang has fired what it believes to be a ballistic missile from a submarine. Now, they say that